So here to discuss what Governor Scott had to say are David Patten, the senior editor from Newsmax. Joining us via Skype from Boston is Howie Carr, and alongside here again, Newsmax TV contributor Francesca Page. Thank you all for being here. Before we get to the I word, let's take it alphabetically, H before I, healthcare. And Governor Scott thinks that the problem starts with the federal government. And this is in reference to both these issues. Take a listen.
Well, we're a country of legal immigration. Our federal government has absolutely failed us. They haven't secured our borders. They don't have an immigration policy that's working. That's why we have the problem. And what states are dealing with is the fact that our federal government has not done their job. They're still not doing their job.
So the question becomes, is this, David Patten, a clever way to spin it because the federal government hasn't done its job? Florida is now going to open, quote, educational opportunity to kids brought here illegally?
Well, there is an amount of cleverness here. I mean, the governor, for all he criticizes his predecessor, Charlie Crist, for being a political shapeshifter, having gone from being a Republican, becoming an independent, and then a Democrat, he's pretty adroit with political messaging himself, and this is a way, by attacking the president, by attacking Obamacare, where he can appeal to his base. We know the base is going to be very important in November, and maybe that'll help keep him energized, considering what he's already said he's going to do with the so-called DREAM Act and allowing tuition, in-state tuition, for people who are not supposed to be here. Francesca
Page, your take on this?
I mean, I'm wondering if this is another form of amnesty. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's a clever talking point to equate it with amnesty, but I mean, after all, it's sort of on a range. We're not quite going all the way to amnesty, right? Because a student who's here illegally gets in-state tuition to go to college doesn't change their legal status, doesn't change their family's legal status. Now, you can make a pragmatic point that once you take this step, that it's some sort of de facto amnesty, or you're headed in that direction. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
Well, let's get the take from Boston. Howie Carr, you spend a fair amount of time in Florida doing in-depth analysis of what transpires in the Sunshine State as opposed to what's happening in the Northeast. When you hear Rick Scott talk about this opportunity for children living in Florida who may not be citizens to go to school, what's your take on it?
Well, I heard him talk about living the dream, JD. Does living the dream include students from Georgia and Alabama, the neighboring states? I mean, do they get in-state tuition? What about me? I've lived in Florida off and on most of my life, and you're right, I own property down here, but my kids are considered out of state. Why is that? I mean, why do, he said zip codes don't matter, your neighborhood doesn't matter. Well, what about your state? What is this? And what always happens in these things, it certainly happened in Massachusetts, is they couldn't get this through the legislature, so it became an executive order by the governor, Deval Patrick, Barack Obama's best friend. And they always said, well, it's only for students who graduated from high schools in Massachusetts. And then you look at the fine print of the bill, JD, you know the way this works. You look at the fine print, and that's not what it said. It said you had to graduate from a Massachusetts high school or the equivalent thereof, which means you could come from anywhere and get in-state tuition in Massachusetts as long as you weren't from one of the other 49 states. And I'll bet anything there's going to be some kind of fine print in Governor Scott's proposal as well.
Howie, how do you think the governor's plan is going to be received by the rest of the GOP?
I don't think it's going to be received well. I can just tell you, in Massachusetts, a really, really blue state, they couldn't get this thing through the legislature, even with a 4-to-1 Democrat majority. Maybe things are different now, but when Mitt Romney was governor, he said, "I'll veto this if you try to give in-state tuition to illegals," and they decided to take a vote in an election year, and all the Democrats voted thumbs down. I don't think this is going to be real popular with Democrats either. Well, JD, can you see it? I mean,
well, Howie, this is the big thing. While it's continually portrayed by the establishment that this is just inevitable and it's humane, everybody you've seen embrace this. Take a look at Marco Rubio. It was like kryptonite to that young Superman in terms of national politics. So I remain skeptical that this will work. And yet, David Patten, you've got this situation here in Florida where here is Governor Scott succeeding Jeb Bush. Jeb, of course, went as far as calling illegal immigration an act of love. That's clearly the establishment point of view. But Florida history does differ, at least over the last half century, with the rest of the country, given the influx of Cubans coming to the United States, political exile at the height of the Cold War. Of course, we had the Mariel boat lift in the late 70s, but that impacted, ironically, Bill Clinton in Fort Chavey, Arkansas, probably more than any other politician. Is this?
But JD, we're not talking about Cubans here. You know.
Well, I know, but what I have to get the take on, Howie, is from David here about the Florida experience. Is this enough to keep everybody together and propel Scott on to victory?
So the name of the game is keep your base, right? Get your base, the partisan part of the party, out to the polls to vote for you, and then appeal to enough of those independents up and down the I-4 corridor, for example, Tampa to Orlando. Get those folks over on your side, and then you have the formula to win. I think a lot of what Scott's calculation is simply based on numbers. You've got about 17 to 20% Latino population in Florida. You've got about 15, 16% African American population. A tremendous percentage of immigrants, as we know. The Miami area, Fort Lauderdale area draws from all around the Caribbean. So he's trying to put together a coalition that'll win in November against a very adroit, skillful politician who knows this would be a wedge issue that he could use to really hurt Scott.
Well, I think Howie, JD, and yourself would probably all agree that this is going to be a hot button issue coming up, not just for the governors here, but also for the election and the presidential race for 2016.
And that's really what the stakes are here. It's a really good point, because whoever wins this election is going to control Florida, perhaps the most important purple swing state on the map in 2016. Could be a tremendous asset for a Republican GOP presidential candidate.
Howie, I know you're dying to get back into this thing, and I want to get you back into it because of all this, quote, election calculus. You and I can go down the list. We talked about Rubio earlier. He embraced this, and you watched what happened to his national profile.
Right.
Jeb Bush.
How about right now, Eric Cantor? Ask him how the outreach is going. He's running for his life in Virginia because he was basically an amnesty supporter. Now he's claiming he's not an amnesty supporter. This is the number 2 guy in the House of Representatives. He's in the fight of his life against against a guy named Bratt.
Yeah, it's interesting. Professor Bratt is making things tough for Eric Cantor. And, of course, in Arizona, who could forget a certain guy challenging the senior senator there and seeing the ads where the senior senator spoke about building the dang fence, only to return to a gang of 8 and push amnesty once he was reelected. Again, David, it comes down to this notion of calculus. And even though Governor Scott, now every answer is through a personal prism, whether about his grandson or his dad being a military veteran or growing up in public housing, to talk about his modest roots and personalizing, with this, is it almost a position that is too clever, that people who have a tendency to view the governor as calculating, you've just gone through the political calculus.
Right, correct.
Is there a risk that by doing this, rather than being seen as more personal and softening his image, people go, there's that Rick Scott. He's a bottom line numbers guy, and he's just calculating his response.
The intricacies of political science. If only somebody could predict how voters are going to respond to what, after all, is a flip-flop for the governor. In 2010, he was for really tough immigration, no DREAM Act, and here we are 4 years later, and he's flipped on it. It's possible that he could be seen as less principled. It is a danger for him that his base may become less energized. That's why he's got to really hit hard on issues like Obamacare that the base cares about greatly, so that he can keep them in the fight, because he's going to need them in November.
So I guess the question comes down, will it be Obamacare or illegal immigration, and will enough border hawks swallow hard and stick with Governor Scott in Florida? It'll be interesting to see. Howie, we want you to hang in. We're going to be back with some issues not entirely specific to Boston, but some ideas and some concepts with which you have more than passing familiarity. That's coming up next. We also want to invite you to weigh in on Governor Scott's softening in terms of tuition for illegals. You can tweet me your comments at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. You can also email us, connect@newsmaxtv.com. And yes, there's always Facebook. You'll see our faces again following this time out.